What if everything you've been taught about the beginning of humanity is a carefully edited version of a much stranger, darker, and more complex truth? The Bible opens with a simple, powerful declaration. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then it moves to the creation of man, Adam, formed from the dust of the ground. It's a clear, foundational narrative that has shaped civilizations. But what if the Genesis account is only a summary, a condensed version of a story that was far more detailed, involving events and beings that existed before the first man and woman ever set foot in the Garden of Eden? Tucked away in the annals of ancient history, preserved by a handful of scribes and discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, lies a text that challenges the very foundation of biblical history, the Book of Enoch. This ancient manuscript, dismissed by many as mere myth but revered by others as a lost book of the Bible, reveals a world teeming with giants, fallen angels, and a pre-Adamic race whose existence changes everything we think we know about creation, the flood, and our own origins. To understand this hidden history, we must first look at the canonical text of Genesis, specifically a passage that has puzzled theologians for millennia. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, reads, "When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, 'My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years.' The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown." For centuries, readers have stumbled over this cryptic passage. Who exactly were these sons of God? And who were the Nephilim, the heroes of old that they produced? The mainstream accepted interpretation for much of Christian history has been that the sons of God were the righteous descendants of Seth, and the daughters of men were the unrighteous descendants of Cain, and their intermarriage led to a society of fallen, powerful people. But this interpretation, while tidy, is a relatively late development. The earliest Jewish traditions, the ones that would have been familiar to Jesus and the apostles, held a far more explosive view. The sons of God were not human. They were angels. According to the Book of Enoch and other Second Temple period texts like the Book of Jubilees, a group of 200 angels known as the Watchers were dispatched to earth to instruct and nurture humanity. Their mission was divine, meant to be a blessing. But over time they grew arrogant and their eyes were caught by the beauty of human women. Abandoning their heavenly post, these Watchers descended to Mount Hermon and swore a pact to take human wives and father children. The Book of Enoch, in its vivid narrative, describes this fall from grace not as a single moment of temptation, but as a calculated rebellion. The leader of this host was an angel named Semjaza, and with him 200 others descended to commit the ultimate transgression, the mingling of the divine with the mortal. This was not just disobedience, it was a violation of the fundamental boundaries of creation. The angels were supposed to be keepers of the cosmic order, not disruptors of it. Their transgression was a rebellion against the very structure of God's universe, and from this forbidden union, a new race was born, the Nephilim. The Book of Enoch describes them in terrifying terms, not as the slightly taller humans of later mythologies, but as monstrous giants who devoured the resources of the earth and began to consume humanity itself. They were the mighty men of old, men of renown, but their renown was born of violence and corruption. The text says they began to sin against birds, animals, reptiles, and fish, and one another, devouring the produce of the earth, and even turning to cannibalism. These half-angel, half-human hybrids were a corrupting force on a planet already struggling with human wickedness, but the corruption brought by the Watchers went far beyond their giant offspring. The Book of Enoch details how the Watchers, in their rebellion, taught humanity forbidden knowledge. One of their leaders, Azazel, is singled out for teaching men the art of making swords, knives, shields, and armor. He showed them the metals of the earth and how to work them. He taught women how to use cosmetics, to paint their eyes and beautify themselves, leading to increased lust and immorality. Other Watchers taught the knowledge of sorcery, the cutting of roots, the enchantments of plants, astrology, and the signs of the heavens. This narrative of a pre-flood world brimming with advanced knowledge and grotesque violence shifts the context of Genesis dramatically. The story of Adam and Eve is no longer the singular origin of all humanity. It is a story of human creation, yes, but it is quickly followed by the story of the Watchers and the Nephilim, a separate group of beings who are not descendants of Adam, but are nonetheless part of the Earth's population. This is the core of the title's assertion. There were humans who existed before Adam and Eve, or at least beings who looked human and walked the earth before the biblical patriarch was created. This idea is known as the pre-Adamite hypothesis. While not a part of mainstream Christian doctrine, it has been a point of fascination and speculation for centuries. The Book of Enoch, however, doesn't speak of a pre-Adamite race in the sense of a separate human creation. Instead, it presents a world where humanity, as created by God, is the victim of a hostile takeover by angelic forces and their hybrid offspring. The existence of these Nephilim also provides a devastatingly logical answer to a question that has always hung over the story of Noah's flood. Why was the destruction of the entire world by a global deluge necessary? The Genesis account says the earth was filled with violence and wickedness, but the Book of Enoch explains that violence and wickedness, the earth wasn't just full of bad people, it was full of monsters. The genetic corruption of the human bloodline by the Watchers was the primary cause of God's wrath. The flood wasn't just a punishment for human sin, it was an act of cosmic quarantine, a desperate attempt to preserve a pure human bloodline from which the promised Redeemer would eventually come. Enoch, the seventh from Adam, is the pivotal figure in this narrative. In the canonical Bible, we are told he walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more because God took him away. The Book of Enoch fills in the enormous gap that these few words leave. It describes him not just as a holy man, but as a scribe of righteousness, a prophet, and an intercessor between the divine and the fallen Watchers. When the Watchers realized the depth of their transgression and the judgment that was coming, they sent one of their giant sons, Maweh, to Enoch to ask him to plead with God on their behalf. Enoch agrees to intercede but pronounces God's judgment upon them. The Watchers had no hope of salvation. Their fate was sealed. The Book of Enoch goes on to describe Enoch's incredible visions and journeys through the heavens. He travels through the 10 heavens, seeing the abodes of the righteous and the fallen angels. He learns the secrets of the universe, the foundations of the earth, the courses of the stars, the sources of the winds, and the chambers of the sun and moon. He is transformed into the heavenly scribe, a figure of immense significance in later Jewish mysticism. The fragments of the Book of the Watchers and the Book of Giants found among the Dead Sea Scrolls confirm that this narrative was not a fringe belief, but a core part of the religious landscape of Second Temple Judaism. The Qumran community, which produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, held these texts in extremely high regard. They didn't just have one copy, they had multiple manuscripts of the Book of Enoch and the Book of Giants, indicating that they were considered essential scripture. This challenges the modern notion that these texts were obscure or heretical. They were mainstream for a significant portion of the ancient world. The Book of Giants, a separate but related work, expands on the narrative of the Nephilim. Found alongside the Book of Enoch at Qumran, it provides further details about the names of the giants and their activities. These fragments tell of the giant brothers Ohia and Hahia, who have terrifying dreams that they cannot interpret. They send another giant, Maweh, to Enoch to obtain an interpretation of their visions. Enoch, true to his role, provides the oracle of judgment, telling them that God's wrath will be unleashed upon them and their fathers, the Watchers. Interestingly, the Qumran fragments of the Book of Giants also include references to legendary figures from Mesopotamian mythology, such as Gilgamesh and the monster Humbaba. This suggests a fascinating cultural blending, where ancient pagan traditions about demigods and heroes were incorporated into the Jewish apocalyptic framework to tell a coherent story about the origins of evil. The existence of the Book of Enoch raises another profound question. Why is it not in the Bible? The answer reveals a great deal about how the biblical canon was formed. The Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, was compiled over centuries with a strong focus on the law of Moses. By the time the final selection of texts was made, the Book of Enoch, with its vivid angelology and apocalyptic visions, was deemed outside the bounds of the inspired text, mainly due to its lack of Mosaic authority. It wasn't a law book, it was a story. However, its influence on the New Testament authors is undeniable and often overlooked. The Apostle Jude, in his short epistle, directly quotes from the Book of Enoch. He writes, "Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about them. See, the Lord is coming with thousands upon thousands of his holy ones to judge everyone and to convict all of them of all the ungodly acts they have committed in their ungodliness and of all the defiant words ungodly sinners have spoken against him." This is a direct quote from 1 Enoch 1:9. The Apostle Peter, in his second epistle, refers to the angels who sinned. God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment. A passage that makes no sense without the context of the Watchers' rebellion in Enoch. These New Testament references demonstrate that the early Christians, including the apostles, were intimately familiar with the Enochic traditions. They considered the stories of the Watchers and Nephilim to be a factual part of their theological history. It was only later, as the church solidified its doctrine, that these texts were set aside. The Book of Enoch was preserved remarkably by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, who have included it in their biblical canon for centuries. What does this mean for our understanding of history and human origins? The video title asks, "What happened to them?" Changes everything. Understanding the fate of the Watchers and their giant offspring provides a new lens through which to view the entire narrative of the Bible. First, it reframes the biblical view of evil. In the traditional Genesis story, evil is an abstract concept that enters the world through human disobedience in a garden. In the Enochic view, evil is a physical, genetic, and cosmic corruption. It enters the world through the willful transgression of divine law by powerful celestial beings. This explains the severity of the flood and the eventual necessity of the Mosaic law to constrain human sin. Second, it redefines the concept of the image of God. In Genesis, humanity is created in God's image. The Enochic tradition emphasizes that this image is sacred and that the Watchers violated this divine creation by fundamentally altering what it means to be human. The Nephilim were not in the image of God. They were hybrids, a perversion of the natural order. Third, it elevates the figure of Enoch, placing him as the missing link between the corrupted antediluvian world and the redeemed post-flood world. His removal from the earth before the flood signifies God's preservation of a righteous line. The Book of Enoch also speaks of the fate of the spirits of the Nephilim. When the giants were destroyed in the flood, their physical bodies perished, but their spirits, being part angelic, could not die. According to the Book of Enoch, these disembodied spirits roam the earth, causing havoc, temptation, and disease. They are the source of demons and unclean spirits, a concept that appears frequently in the New Testament. This provides a coherent origin story for demonic activity, tying it directly to the events of the antediluvian world. The early church fathers, like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus, also held to these beliefs about the fallen angels and the origin of demons. This understanding of the cosmos, where a forgotten war in heaven and a failed angelic mission to earth continues to affect the world, imbues the biblical narrative with a depth and urgency that the sanitized, isolated stories of Genesis do not have. It suggests that we are not just sinners in need of redemption from our own faults. We are inhabitants of a universe still reeling from an ancient cosmic conflict. The events of Genesis 6 were not a minor footnote. They were the decisive moment that led to the flood, the judgment of the angels, and the ultimate need for a Messiah to restore order and purify creation. The narrative of the Book of Enoch is not just a historical curiosity. It is a deeply provocative work that challenges the reader to rethink the nature of Scripture, the history of the ancient world, and the spiritual realities that underpin our existence. It reveals a God who is not simply a distant creator, but a sovereign judge who acts decisively against cosmic rebellion. The story of the Watchers and the Nephilim provides a shocking backdrop to the story of Noah, transforming it from a simple moral tale into a grand epic of judgment and redemption. By exploring these forbidden texts, we step into a world where the boundaries between the human, the divine, and the monstrous are blurred, where giants walk the earth and where angels fell from grace. The Book of Enoch was a cornerstone of Jewish apocalyptic thought, and its echoes can be heard throughout the New Testament. To ignore it is to ignore a foundational piece of the puzzle of the Bible. It changes everything because it shows us that the old stories are far stranger, more terrifying, and ultimately more hopeful than we ever imagined. But what if the story did not begin in a garden with a single man and woman? What if the biblical narrative, as we have received it, is only the final chapter of a much longer and more complex story, a story that begins not with Adam, but with beings who existed before him, a race whose existence and fate reshape our entire understanding of human origins, divine judgment, and the nature of evil itself? The Book of Enoch, an ancient text removed from most Bibles but preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon and among the Dead Sea Scrolls, presents a version of history that challenges the very foundation of Genesis. It speaks of a world populated not only by the descendants of Adam, but by the offspring of fallen angels, a hybrid race of giants whose corruption of the earth was so complete that it necessitated a global flood. But even this narrative hides a deeper secret, one that concerns the existence of a pre-Adamic race, beings who walked the earth before the creation of the first biblical man, and whose story, when properly understood, changes everything. The traditional Genesis account, as found in the first chapters of the Bible, describes a sequential creation, the heavens and the earth, then plants, then animals, and finally, the creation of man and woman in the image of God. This narrative has been the bedrock of Western cosmology for millennia. However, embedded within this narrative is a cryptic passage in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, which has troubled readers for centuries. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown, NIV. The Book of Enoch, also known as 1st Enoch, was written to expand upon this enigmatic passage, and it does so with a wealth of detail that fundamentally recasts our understanding of the pre-flood world. According to 1st Enoch, the sons of God were not the righteous descendants of Seth, as later Christian theologians would argue, but a group of 200 fallen angels, known as the Watchers, who descended to earth, took human wives, and taught humanity forbidden knowledge, including the art of weapon-making, cosmetics, sorcery, and astrology. Their transgression was not merely a moral failing, but a violation of the cosmic order, a mingling of the divine and the mortal that corrupted the creation. The offspring of these unions were the Nephilim, a race of giants who, according to the text, began to devour the resources of the earth and ultimately turned to cannibalism. This narrative, as shocking as it is only part of the story. The Book of Enoch's account of the Watchers and the Nephilim suggests a world where humanity was not the only sentient race. The existence of the Nephilim, beings who were not fully human but also not fully divine, implies that Adam and Eve were not the sole inhabitants of the earth. This is where the concept of a pre-Adamic race begins to emerge. While the Book of Enoch doesn't explicitly use the term pre-Adamite, the implications of its narrative are clear. There were beings on the earth who were not descendants of Adam, who were the product of a divine transgression, and who were ultimately destroyed by the flood. However, the narrative becomes even more complex when we consider the Book of Giants, a related text found among the Dead Sea Scrolls that expands upon the fate of the Nephilim and provides a crucial link between the Watchers and the story of the flood. The Book of Giants, which was also found in Aramaic fragments at Qumran, offers a unique perspective on the fate of these hybrid beings. The Book of Giants focuses on the giants themselves, giving them names like Ohya, Hahya, and Mahweh, describing their dreams and their desperate attempts to avoid the judgment that Enoch had pronounced upon them. When the giants realized that the flood was imminent, they sent Mahweh to Enoch to plead for mercy. But Enoch's message was one of unequivocal judgment. The Watchers would be bound and cast into the abyss, and their offspring would be destroyed by the flood. The Book of Giants also connects these ancient events to other legendary figures. Fragments of the text mention names like Gilgamesh and Humbaba, heroes from Mesopotamian mythology, suggesting that the ancient writers saw these pagan tales as corrupted memories of the real events involving the Nephilim. This blending of biblical and pagan traditions indicates that the story of the Watchers was a widespread and influential myth in the ancient Near East, one that attempted to explain the presence of powerful semi-divine heroes in human history. The discovery of these texts among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran reveals the profound importance of the Enochic literature to the religious landscape of Second Temple Judaism. The fact that multiple copies of the Book of Enoch and the Book of Giants were found in the Qumran caves, alongside the Book of Jubilees and other apocalyptic works, demonstrates that these texts were considered authoritative scripture by the community that lived there. This challenges the modern Christian notion that these texts were obscure or heretical. They were, in fact, central to the worldview of many ancient Jews. However, the evidence from the Aramaic Dead Sea Scrolls also suggests that these traditions were not confined to a single Enochic group, but were part of a broader scribal culture that drew on a variety of exalted patriarchs, including Noah, Abraham, and Daniel, to convey its theological messages. The Qumran community's interest in the Enochic traditions extended to the Book of Giants, which they evidently considered an important part of the Enochic corpus. Józef Milik, the Polish scholar who published the Editio Princeps of the Aramaic Enoch fragments, controversially suggested that the Book of Giants should be considered a part of Or Enoch itself, appearing after the Book of Watchers, though this theory has not been widely accepted. The Book of Giants also provides a more detailed account of the Nephilim's fate and their connection to the flood. The giants are not just mindless monsters, they are depicted as beings who are aware of their impending doom. Their dreams, often interpreted by Enoch, are a central motif of the text, foreshadowing the divine judgment that will overtake them. This narrative adds a tragic dimension to their story. They are not merely evil, but are also caught in a destiny they cannot escape. This has led some scholars to view the Enochic traditions as a profound meditation on the nature of evil, the consequences of rebellion against the divine order, and the ultimate justice of God. The influence of these traditions extended far beyond the Dead Sea Scrolls. The themes of the Watchers and the Giants, the corruption of the human race by angelic beings, the birth of hybrids, and the flood as a means of cosmic quarantine are taken up and reinterpreted in a variety of late antique texts, including the Nag Hammadi codices, which contain works such as the Apocryphon of John. The Apocryphon of John, a Gnostic text from the 2nd or 3rd century CE, provides a fascinating reinterpretation of the Watcher myth. In this text, the story of the Watchers is woven into a larger cosmic drama involving the Archons, the rulers of the material world, who are created by a flawed and arrogant divine being named Yaldabaoth. The Apocryphon of John describes how Yaldabaoth and his angels, jealous of the divine light that exists within humanity, create a counterfeit spirit and send their angels to the daughters of men to corrupt them. This version of the myth adds a layer of metaphysical complexity to the story, framing the Watchers' transgression not just as rebellion, but as a deliberate attempt by evil forces to trap humanity in ignorance. The same themes appear in other Nag Hammadi texts, such as the Hypostasis of the Archons and On the Origin of the World, where the story of the Watchers is used to explain the origins of evil and the nature of the material world. This demonstrates that the Enochic traditions were not a static set of beliefs, but were creatively adapted and reimagined by different religious groups to address their own theological concerns. The influence of the Enochic traditions, especially the concept of the Watchers and the Giants, extends even into the New Testament. The Epistle of Jude quotes directly from the Book of Enoch, attributing a prophecy to Enoch, the seventh from Adam. The Apostle Peter also refers to the angels who sinned and were cast into chains of darkness, a clear reference to the Watchers' punishment. The Gospel of Matthew also shows possible influence from Enochic traditions, particularly in its infancy narrative and in its use of the term Son of Man, which is a central title in the Book of Enoch for the pre-existent eschatological judge. The Parables of Enoch, a section of Amorphorian Enoch that many scholars date to the late 1st century BCE, contains some of the most developed and explicit messianic language in all of the Second Temple literature, describing a figure called the Son of Man, or the Elect One, who sits on a throne of glory and judges the world. This has led to a robust scholarly debate about the relationship between Enochic thought and early Christology, with some scholars arguing that the New Testament writers were deeply influenced by these traditions. If you found this exploration into the hidden history of the pre-flood world fascinating, then you will want to dive even deeper. For a complete, unabridged experience of these ancient texts, we highly recommend checking out the audiobook edition of the Book of Enoch, which includes expert commentary and brings the incredible story of the Watchers to life. The link is in the description below. And if you want to know more about the ancient context, what are your thoughts on these beings that existed before Adam? Were they a separate creation, a hybrid race, or something else entirely? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more deep dives into ancient mysteries and the secrets of history.